Are we ready? So we're going to make an electrode. Yay! The first thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out the structure for our base cloth. What do we want our base cloth to be? Why? Because it's easy and it has so many interlacements. Both are acceptable answers. All right, so I have tappy. Now maybe I should figure out what I want my supplemental weft pattern to be. So what should I do? Options are twill, satin, complex twill. Those are all kind of floaty structures. Satin. Okay. So here I have a 5-2 satin. And so a 5-2 satin basically is like a twill, but instead of having all the interlacements in a diagonal, it spaces them out as far as it can from each other. And what that actually allows a satin to do is pack a lot denser than a twill, because when you have neighboring interlacements, they repel each other, almost like a magnet. So the farther you put the magnets away from each other, the less force they have. And so satins are always the structures that are going to pack the most. And again, kind of like a twill, you can change how wide the floats are. This is a 1-4 satin, which means the floats are going to be 4 picks long. But you can also come here and make them much wider. A true satin will only be valid with certain move numbers. So this is like, we'll get into satins later if people are interested. But essentially, you're looking for the setting where the interlacements are as far apart as they possibly can from each other. And there's a certain mathematical formula you can use to figure out what this is. Okay.
Is satin normally the best pattern for like biofeedback and biosensing because it's like a little, because of the way it packs it?
So it turned out that it was in our tests. I was worried because satin is also the least structurally. So you would imagine that, yes, you get the most on the surface, but you also create the most movement across the surface. Like each of those floats can move quite a bit. The nice thing with a satin is that, and I'll bring in my samples, but like tabby doesn't stretch at all because there's a bunch of interlacements. When you have a twill, you'll realize it stretches in one direction because almost like a scissor linkage, all those twills can kind of pull. In a satin, it stretches equally in both directions. And so I could see that that actually has some nice effect, like maybe it evens out. But I think in general, a satin is the best structure to use. The hard thing about satins is that like sometimes you need more shafts to make the satin you need, right? Because of the way that they're structured, they're not as easy as a twill to rescale. So yeah, we'll start with this satin structure. Then I'm going to draw my artwork. Here I'm just going to create this blank draft tool. Oops, I lost my mouse. Here, I'll just do this instead. I'm going to create artwork that's 20 by 20. So I created this blank screen. I'm going to open it up. I'm just going to expand the draft view. And I'm going to select, I'm going to just draw all these black. And I'm going to do a heart. Except for what's would be better to do is to do this in a graphics editor and import the image. I'm not going to go into how to do that today because there's some certain image format stuff that has to hold. So I'm just drawing in this heart. Okay? So now I have this heart. I have my structure, and I have my base structure. So let's say I'm doing this on one of these looms. I'm going to create a rectangle, which sort of defines the entire space of my cloth. So, come on. Don't fail me now. What are you doing? Nope, you should be fine. Are we having internet issues? No. Okay, let me just make sure I'm logged in. So I can save it. I'm going to call this in class demo. Going great. Why is none of this moving? Okay, that moves. Is there like a weird, okay. There we go. Now it works. All right, so let's say we have 40 ends in our cloth and we want our design to go across 40 picks. So that's my base cloth draft now. I'm going to do the same thing for my satin. So I'm going to copy this structure, 40 by 40. Instead of giving it tabby, I'm going to give it this satin. The other way I can do this is like if I just wanted a tabby with a supplemental weft that's satin, not in a pattern, but just across the whole width, I could use the interlace feature, interlace wefts, and I could take that and I could interlace it with that. That gives us our draft. And so you can visualize that as well. And so here we see, okay, the surface of the cloth is a little bit messy because I suck at programming. Okay, so now I don't just want to have the whole cloth be this supplemental weft structure. I just want to do the inlay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to resize this heart to be the same size as my cloth. So let's say I want this heart to also be 40 by 40. Okay, and we can zoom in a little bit. Then there's a function called fill, and I can say take this pattern and fill all the black cells with this structure. And so that gives me kind of what the inlay pattern's going to be. Then I can do the same interlacement operation. And now I would follow that draft, right? So on the first row, I would weave nothing. Probably going to break here. So this is why when I was telling you on Monday, sometimes I like to have nothing rows, just to kind of signify like I'm doing nothing here. So this is a nothing row, then tabby. Nothing, tabby, nothing, tabby, nothing, tabby. And then eventually I'll lift this warp and I'll put my inlay underneath it. And then I'll just work that back and forth across the whole cloth. And eventually I might get this heart shape back out. It's a little easier to visualize with, instead of showing these as white, showing them as like, there's actually going to be no weft in this region. It's just inlay. And I have a way of doing that where you create a blank draft, and then I have a heddle called the unset heddle. And that just means that there's literally nothing going on at that point in the draft. And it colors it blue. So then you can kind of see the outline of the heart a little bit better. So yeah, that's how I would do this in AdaCAD. Questions? I'm sure there's questions. I guess the nice thing here, and the reason you set it up in this whole complicated thing, is let's say we weave this sample and then we realize this structure is just way too floaty and I need it to be smaller. Most weavers would have to then go draft it all by hand again. And so the nice thing about the setup here is we can just like make my satin much smaller and it'll automatically just update the draft for you. Or I don't want it to be tabby, I want it to be a basket weave. You can just come in and now the bottom is a basket weave and the supplemental is this satin. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. I will end there. Sometimes I think with things like inlay, honestly, it helps me more just to think of these two things and not the rest. Like, what's my base cloth? What's my inlay? And then I almost do it entirely freehand, right? Because on the loom, things are going to pack at different ratios. So I find that like the more planning I do, the more pain I end up going through trying to enact that exact plan. So if you approach it a little more with a like, okay, in general, I know having a floating structure and having tabby is going to create this effect. Then I can do a few rows, see what's happening, and I can adjust it freehand, or I can just abandon that and start something else. So for me, and I think a lot of other weavers, really just knowing these different structures and how they'll relate together is the easiest way. When you're working on a Jacquard loom, it's really nice because I literally just upload this pattern and it lifts those picks for me. But because we have this heart here, this is going to totally break a shaft loom because it's going to want a different shaft for every segment of that heart. So oftentimes too, the easier way to do this is just to do, to not even worry about what your artwork is and just to visualize what it's going to look like when you have that structure together. So here I'm going to just duplicate this, take that out. So I can look at something like this and be like, okay, now I have a satin that's interlaced with a basket weave. And I can even change that. I'll just go back and do a plain tabby. Then I can visualize it, right? Okay, it's going to look kind of like this. That satin is going to float to the surface and my tabby is going to hold it all together. I can go in and make those different colors. So let's say I want my weft materials to repeat red and yellow. And this will just help me see these two systems more clearly. Then I'll add those colors and then it updates. And you can see like, okay, the yellow picks are floating on the surface of the red picks. The other thing you can do here now is you can change the loom type. So actually, it looks like you can make this with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 frames. It's a bummer. We almost got there. So this would generate you the treadling pattern for that overall structure, and then you would just manually on these rows with the float not carry it the whole way across. So it's hard, like depending on the equipment you're using, your style of design might look very different. So in any case, it's kind of interesting just to think of the structures and how they map to your loom, and then to remix them and play with them on the fly while you're weaving. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.